What if I told you that the most brutal serial killer in history wasn't Jack the Ripper or Ted Bundy, but a noblewoman who tortured and murdered over 650 young girls in her quest to stay forever young? What if I told you she literally bathed in their blood, believing it would preserve her beauty? What if I told you this isn't a horror movie, but documented historical fact that happened in a castle in Hungary over 400 years ago? Meet Elizabeth Báthory, the Blood Countess, a woman so evil that her name became synonymous with vampirism and inspired countless horror stories. But the real story is far more terrifying than any fiction, because it actually happened. For decades, she lured innocent peasant girls to her castle with promises of work, and then subjected them to torture so horrific that grown men who investigated her crimes couldn't sleep for weeks afterward. This isn't just a story about one woman's madness. This is a story about how absolute power corrupts absolutely, how beauty standards can drive people to literally kill for vanity, and how an entire society can turn a blind eye to evil when it's committed by someone wealthy and powerful enough to be considered untouchable. Elizabeth Báthory was born in 1560 into one of the most powerful families in Hungary. The Báthorys owned local cities, commanded private armies, and were related to kings. Elizabeth's uncle was the King of Poland. Her cousins were cardinals and generals. Her family controlled more wealth than most entire countries. She was literally born into a world where she believed she could do anything to anyone without consequences. But here's what makes her story even more chilling. She wasn't born evil. Contemporary accounts describe young Elizabeth as intelligent, educated, and even compassionate. She spoke 4 languages fluently, was well-versed in politics and literature, and seemed destined for a normal life as a powerful noblewoman. So what happened? How does someone go from a promising young aristocrat to history's most prolific female serial killer? The transformation began with her marriage at age 15 to Ferenc Nadasdy, a brutal warrior known as the Black Knight of Hungary. Ferenc was famous for his cruelty to prisoners of war, his innovative torture techniques, and his complete lack of mercy toward enemies. He introduced Elizabeth to the idea that causing pain to others could be entertaining, that torture was an art form, and that the lives of peasants were worthless compared to the pleasures of the nobility. But Ferenc was often away fighting wars, leaving Elizabeth alone in their massive castle with unlimited power over hundreds of servants and peasants. Imagine being a teenager with absolute authority over other people's lives, with no oversight, no consequences for your actions, and a husband who actually encouraged cruelty. The combination was toxic, and it didn't take long for Elizabeth to discover she enjoyed having power over life and death. The first incident happened when Elizabeth was just 16 years old. A servant girl accidentally pulled her hair while helping her dress, and Elizabeth flew into a rage that shocked even the hardened castle guards. She didn't just slap the girl or scream at her. She grabbed a pair of scissors and stabbed the servant repeatedly, while screaming about how dare a peasant touch her noble person. It was over and over. Sivious path. The girl died, and Elizabeth felt something she had never experienced before. A rush of absolute power that was almost sexual in its intensity. From that moment on, Elizabeth began finding excuses to punish servants for increasingly minor infractions. A girl who served dinner too slowly would be beaten with iron rods. A maid who didn't curtsy properly would have her fingers broken. A seamstress who made a small mistake on a dress would be branded with hot irons. But these punishments weren't enough to satisfy Elizabeth's growing appetite for cruelty. She began developing elaborate torture methods that showed a creativity for causing pain that rivals anything from the Spanish Inquisition. She would force girls to stand naked in the snow until they froze to death while she watched from her warm tower. She would cover servants in honey and tie them up outside so that insects would eat them alive. She invented devices specifically designed to cause maximum pain without killing too quickly, because she wanted to savor their suffering. But the most horrific part was how she justified all of this to herself. Elizabeth convinced herself that she was improving the moral character of her servants through punishment, that pain would make them better people, that she was actually doing God's work by correcting their peasant flaws. The ability of a human mind to rationalize evil is one of the most terrifying aspects of this entire story. The servants living in Elizabeth's castle existed in a state of constant terror. They never knew when the Countess would decide they had committed some offense worthy of torture or death. They watched their friends disappear and knew better than to ask questions. They lived knowing that any day could be their last, and that their death would be slow and agonizing if Elizabeth was in the mood for entertainment. Word of Elizabeth's cruelty began to spread through the Hungarian countryside, but nobody could do anything about it. She was too powerful, too well-connected, too wealthy to be challenged by local authorities. Peasant families who complained about their missing daughters were told to be grateful that their children had been chosen to serve such an important noblewoman. The legal system that was supposed to protect people was completely corrupted by Elizabeth's influence and wealth. Everything changed in 1585 when Elizabeth made a discovery that would transform her from a cruel noblewoman into history's most notorious serial killer. She was 25 years old and beginning to notice the first signs of aging, tiny lines around her eyes, a slight loss of firmness in her skin, the kind of changes that terrify women who've built their entire identity around their physical beauty. Elizabeth had always been considered exceptionally beautiful, with pale skin that was prized in an era when fair complexion indicated noble birth and wealth. Her beauty was a source of power, a tool she used to manipulate men and intimidate other women. The thought of losing that beauty filled her with a panic that bordered on madness. She became obsessed with finding ways to preserve her youthful appearance at any cost. She tried every beauty treatment available in the 16th century, bathing in milk, applying crushed pearls to her skin, using expensive oils and perfumes imported from across Europe. But nothing seemed to be working, and Elizabeth's desperation grew with each passing day. She consulted with alchemists, witches, and self-proclaimed experts in eternal youth, willing to try anything no matter how dangerous or ridiculous. The moment that changed everything happened during one of Elizabeth's routine torture sessions. She was beating a servant girl with a metal brush when the girl fought back and scratched Elizabeth's face, drawing blood. In her rage, Elizabeth struck the girl so hard that blood splattered across the Countess's hands and face. But when she went to wash off the blood later that evening, Elizabeth noticed something that stopped her cold. The skin where the girl's blood had touched her looked different, younger, smoother, more radiant than the surrounding areas. Elizabeth stared at herself in the mirror, touching the spots where the blood had been, convinced she was seeing the effects of some miraculous beauty treatment. She had discovered what she believed was the secret to eternal youth, the blood of young girls. Now, you might think this was just Elizabeth's imagination, that she was seeing what she wanted to see. But remember, this was a woman who had been raised to believe she was special, chosen by God, destined for greatness. She had never been told no, never been denied anything she wanted, never been forced to accept the normal limitations that apply to other people. In her mind, discovering the fountain of youth wasn't impossible. It was her birthright. Elizabeth became convinced that bathing in the blood of virgin girls would preserve her beauty indefinitely. She developed an elaborate theory about how young blood contained the essence of youth itself, and that by absorbing it through her skin, she could literally steal the vitality of her victims. This wasn't just vanity. In Elizabeth's twisted mind, this was science. She ordered her servants to prepare a special bathtub in the castle's dungeon, a metal tub that could hold large quantities of blood without absorbing it into the material. She had the walls around the tub lined with mirrors, so she could watch herself during her blood baths and observe the supposed effects on her skin. The entire setup was like something from a horror movie, but for Elizabeth, it was a beauty salon. The first full bloodbath required the deaths of 3 young servant girls. Elizabeth had them killed slowly, so their blood would be as fresh as possible when she bathed in it. She stripped naked and lowered herself into the warm blood while it was still steaming, covering every inch of her body. and even drinking small amounts, because she believed consuming the blood would work from the inside out. After her first bloodbath, Elizabeth was convinced she could see immediate improvements in her appearance. She spent hours examining herself in the mirrors, touching her skin, comparing her reflection to how she had looked before. Whether the improvements were real or imagined didn't matter. Elizabeth believed they were real, and that belief drove her to commit increasingly horrific acts. Word of Elizabeth's bloodbaths spread through the castle and created a new level of terror among the servants. It was one thing to risk being tortured or killed for making a mistake, but now they realized that simply being young and healthy made them targets. Elizabeth began selecting victims, not based on any wrongdoing, but purely on the quality of their blood. Young girls with clear skin and rosy complexions were marked for death. The servants tried to make themselves less attractive to Elizabeth by covering their skin with dirt, cutting their hair short, even deliberately scarring themselves to avoid being chosen for the bloodbaths. But Elizabeth had an endless supply of potential victims, as poor families from across the region continued to send their daughters to work in the castle, unaware of the fate that awaited them. Elizabeth's husband, Ferenc, returned from one of his military campaigns to find his castle transformed into a house of horrors. But instead of being shocked or disgusted by what his wife had become, he was fascinated. Ferenc began participating in the torture sessions, contributing his own expertise in causing pain and even helping to select victims for the bloodbaths. The marriage had become a partnership in evil that amplified both of their worst impulses. Together, Elizabeth and Ferenc developed new methods of torture that were designed specifically to produce the highest quality blood for Elizabeth's beauty treatments. They discovered that fear and pain changed the chemical composition of blood, making it less effective for their purposes. So they began drugging their victims to keep them calm before killing them, believing that peaceful blood would be more potent. When Ferenc died in 1604, Elizabeth lost the one person who might have restrained her worst impulses. Instead of mourning her husband's death, she saw it as liberation from the last constraints on her behavior. Now she had absolute power over her vast estates, with no one to question her methods or limit her cruelty. The killing escalated dramatically. Elizabeth was 44 years old when she became a widow, an age when most women of her era were considered elderly. Her fear of aging became an obsession that consumed every waking moment. She convinced herself that she needed increasingly large quantities of young blood to combat the effects of time, requiring more victims and more frequent bloodbaths. She expanded her hunting ground beyond her own servants, sending agents throughout Hungary to recruit young girls for what they claimed were positions in the Countess's household. These recruiters targeted the poorest families, offering wages that seemed too good to be true for simple domestic work. Desperate parents sent their daughters away, believing they were giving them opportunities for better lives. Elizabeth also began accepting girls who were sent to her castle for education and training in noble households. Wealthy families across Europe considered it an honor to have their daughters tutored by such a prominent noblewoman. These girls arrived expecting to learn languages, music, and courtly manners. Instead, they found themselves trapped in a nightmare from which few would ever escape. The castle's dungeons were expanded to accommodate the growing number of victims. Elizabeth had special cells constructed that were designed to keep girls alive, but helpless, for extended periods. She wanted to be able to select victims based on her immediate needs, rather than having to kill girls as soon as they arrived. The dungeons became a horrific warehouse of human beings waiting to die. Elizabeth developed a system for categorizing her victims based on the quality of their blood. Young virgins from noble families were considered premium quality, and their blood was reserved for Elizabeth's most important beauty treatments. Peasant girls were used for routine blood baths and experiments with different torture methods. Older women were used for practice and entertainment when Elizabeth was bored. The torture methods became increasingly sophisticated and cruel as Elizabeth's expertise in causing pain grew. She invented devices that could keep victims conscious and aware, while slowly draining their blood. She developed techniques for maximizing fear and suffering without causing immediate death. She turned torture into an art form that she practiced with the dedication of a master craftsman. But Elizabeth wasn't content with simply killing her victims. She wanted to ensure that their suffering was as intense as possible, because she believed that pain somehow improved the quality of their blood. She would spend hours torturing individual girls, keeping detailed notes about which methods produced the best results, treating human beings like laboratory experiments in her quest for eternal beauty. The most horrific aspect of Elizabeth's killing spree was how systematic and organized it became. She kept detailed records of her victims, noting their ages, backgrounds, and the methods used to kill them. She employed teams of assistants who specialized in different aspects of the murder process. Some focused on recruitment, others on torture, others on disposing of bodies. Elizabeth's assistant, Dorothea Sentis, known as Dorca, became an expert in torture techniques and helped develop many of the devices used in the dungeons. Another assistant, Ilona Joel, specialized in recruiting victims and maintaining the fiction that girls sent to the castle were receiving proper care and education. These women weren't forced to participate in the killing. They chose to help Elizabeth because they enjoyed the power and status that came with serving such a wealthy and influential mistress. The body count began to climb at an alarming rate. Concise estimates suggest Elizabeth killed at least 650 girls during her reign of terror, but some historians believe the actual number may have been much higher. The logistics of disposing of so many bodies became a significant challenge that required careful planning and execution. Initially, Elizabeth had bodies buried in unmarked graves around the castle grounds, but as the killing escalated, she needed more efficient disposal methods. Bodies were burned in massive bonfires that could be seen for miles, creating a constant smell of burning flesh that hung over the castle like a toxic cloud. Local peasants began to associate the smell with the Countess's residence and would cross themselves when the wind carried the smoke toward their villages. Elizabeth's bloodbaths became more frequent and elaborate as her obsession with beauty intensified. She would sometimes bathe in blood multiple times per week, requiring a constant supply of fresh victims. The metal tub in the dungeons was replaced with a larger custom-built basin that could hold the blood of 6 or 7 girls at once. She began experimenting with different types of blood to see if some were more effective than others. She convinced herself that the blood of virgins was superior to that of sexually experienced women, that the blood of noble girls was better than peasant blood, and that blood from victims who died in terror was less effective than blood from those who died peacefully. As Elizabeth entered her 40s, her obsession with maintaining her youthful appearance became the driving force behind every decision she made. She wasn't just killing for pleasure anymore. She genuinely believed that the blood of young girls was the only thing preventing her from aging into an elderly woman. This belief transformed her from a sadistic killer into something far more dangerous, a person who saw murder as a medical necessity. Elizabeth spent enormous sums of money on mirrors, commissioning the finest craftsmen in Europe to create reflective surfaces that would show her appearance in perfect detail. Her castle became filled with mirrors of every size and shape, positioned so that she could examine herself from every angle at any time of day. She would spend hours each morning studying her reflection, searching for any signs of aging that might require additional blood treatments. She employed teams of servants whose only job was to maintain her appearance. Women who specialized in applying cosmetics made from various animal organs. Hairdressers who could create elaborate styles that hid any imperfections. Seamstresses who could alter clothing to disguise any changes in her figure. But no amount of conventional beauty treatments could satisfy Elizabeth's paranoia about aging. Elizabeth became convinced that different parts of her body required different types of blood for optimal preservation. She believed that facial skin needed the blood of very young girls, preferably under 16, while her hands required blood from girls who had done physical labor to maintain their strength. Her hair allegedly needed blood from red-headed victims, and her neck demanded blood from singers to keep her voice young. These beliefs led to increasingly specific requirements for victims. Elizabeth would send detailed instructions to her recruiters, describing exactly what type of girl she needed at any given time. A recruitment order might specify a blonde virgin between 14 and 16 years old with fair skin and no scars, or a dark-haired peasant girl with strong hands and a good singing voice. The complexity of Elizabeth's beauty regimen grew to encompass her entire daily routine. She would begin each morning with a bath in blood that had been collected within the previous 24 hours, believing that fresher blood was more effective. After her blood bath, she would apply various cosmetics made from ground bones, organ meats, and other body parts of her victims. Elizabeth's meals were planned around her beauty treatments as well. She convinced herself that consuming small amounts of young blood with her food would work from inside her body to prevent aging. She had her cooks prepare special dishes that incorporated fresh blood in ways that disguised the taste, turning cannibalism into a daily dietary supplement. Her clothing became part of the beauty obsession as well. Elizabeth would only wear garments that had been dyed with blood, believing that the proximity of the fabric to her skin would provide additional anti-aging benefits. She employed seamstresses who specialized in blood-dyeing techniques, creating elaborate gowns that appeared to be rich red or deep purple, but were actually colored with human blood. Elizabeth's bedroom was transformed into a shrine to her vanity, with mirrors covering every surface and specialized lighting designed to show her appearance in most flattering way possible. She slept on sheets that had been soaked in blood and dried, convinced that even unconscious contact with the fluid would benefit her skin. The entire room smelled of death and decay, but Elizabeth found the scent reassuring because it reminded her of her beauty treatments. The psychological effects of Elizabeth's obsession became apparent to everyone around her. She would fly into murderous rages if anyone suggested she looked older than she had the previous week. She executed servants for making comments about her appearance that she interpreted as criticisms. She became so paranoid about aging that she saw insults and mockery in innocent conversations. Elizabeth began avoiding public appearances during daylight hours, convinced that sunlight would reveal imperfections in her skin that indoor lighting concealed. She would only meet with visitors in dimly lit rooms where shadows would hide any signs of aging. Her fear of being seen as old became so intense that she essentially became a prisoner in her own castle. Her relationship with food became distorted as well. Elizabeth convinced herself that eating certain parts of her victims would provide specific beauty benefits. She believed that consuming the hearts of young girls would keep her own heart strong, that eating their brains would maintain her mental sharpness, and that drinking their blood would preserve her overall vitality. The servants who survived working in Elizabeth's castle described mealtimes as horrific experiences where the Countess would discuss which parts of recently killed girls had been incorporated into each dish. She treated cannibalism as casually as most people discussed seasoning, asking whether the liver in her soup came from the blonde girl killed that morning or the brunette from the previous evening. Elizabeth's correspondence from this period reveals the depth of her delusion. In letters to friends and family members, she would brag about her youthful appearance and attribute it to special beauty treatments that she couldn't discuss in detail. She genuinely believed that she had discovered the secret to eternal youth and considered herself a scientific pioneer rather than a serial killer. By 1609, Elizabeth's appetite for killing had grown so intense that she could no longer satisfy it with peasant girls alone. The blood of commoners was no longer effective enough for her increasingly desperate beauty treatments. She convinced herself that to maintain her youthful appearance as she entered her 50s, she needed the blood of girls from noble families, blood that she believed would be more potent because of its aristocratic origins. This decision marked the beginning of Elizabeth's downfall, because unlike peasant families, noble families had the power and connections to investigate when their daughters disappeared. But Elizabeth's vanity had reached such heights that she was willing to risk everything for what she believed would be the ultimate beauty treatment. Elizabeth established what she called a finishing school for young noblewomen, advertising it as an exclusive academy where daughters of wealthy families could receive the finest education available in Hungary. The curriculum promised instruction in languages, music, dance, literature, and courtly manners. Everything a young noblewoman needed to succeed in high society. "Oh, there is no life for it. You are well here." The marketing for Elizabeth's school was brilliant and targeted exactly the right audience. Wealthy families across Europe were looking for ways to give their daughters advantages in an increasingly competitive social environment. The opportunity to have their daughters educated by a countess who was related to royalty seemed like an incredible opportunity that could secure their futures. The first group of noble girls arrived at Elizabeth's castle in the spring of 1609, expecting to find classrooms, libraries, and qualified teachers. Instead, they found themselves imprisoned in the same dungeons where hundreds of peasant girls had already died. But Elizabeth's treatment of these noble victims was different from her previous murders. She was more careful, more methodical, more focused on extracting maximum value from their aristocratic blood. Elizabeth convinced herself that noble blood required special handling to maintain its potency. She developed elaborate rituals around the killing of aristocratic girls, believing that the manner of their death could affect the quality of their blood. Noble victims were kept in better conditions before being killed, fed special diets designed to improve their blood, and subjected to different torture methods than peasant girls. The torture of noble girls became a form of perverted entertainment for Elizabeth. She would invite other aristocrats to witness the sessions, presenting them as educational demonstrations of proper discipline for unruly servants. These viewing parties became social events where wealthy nobles would gather to watch young women being tortured to death while eating elaborate dinners and drinking expensive wines. But Elizabeth's most fatal mistake was her belief that she could kill noble girls with the same impunity she had shown toward peasants. She underestimated how quickly powerful families would notice when their daughters failed to return home, and how aggressively they would investigate when their inquiries were met with obvious lies and evasions. Some peasant patterns fell for her into the base. Knave asked her through the fire. The first noble family to raise serious concerns was the Zorinius, one of the most powerful dynasties in Hungary. When their 16-year-old daughter failed to return from Elizabeth's school, they sent investigators to the castle, who were told that the girl had died of a sudden illness. But when they demanded to see the body, Elizabeth's servants gave contradictory stories about where she had been buried. Other noble families began comparing notes and realized that an alarming number of girls sent to Elizabeth's school had allegedly died of sudden illnesses, accidents, or mysterious ailments. The pattern was too obvious to ignore, and several families joined together to demand a formal investigation of the Countess's activities. Elizabeth's response to these inquiries revealed just how completely she had lost touch with reality. Instead of being concerned about the investigation, she was angry that these families were interfering with her beauty treatments. She genuinely believed that providing blood for her anti-aging regimen was a higher purpose than these girls could have served in their ordinary lives. She began taking even greater risks, killing noble girls more frequently and with less care about covering up their deaths. Elizabeth was so convinced of her own power and importance that she believed she could simply intimidate or bribe her way out of any investigation. She had been above the law for so long that the concept of facing consequences for her actions was literally incomprehensible to her. The breaking point came when Elizabeth killed Anna Darvulia, the daughter of a prominent judge who had connections throughout the Hungarian legal system. Anna's father refused to accept the story that his daughter had died of natural causes and used his influence to launch a formal investigation that Elizabeth couldn't stop or control. As news of the investigation spread, Elizabeth's behavior became even more erratic. She began killing girls at an accelerated pace, convinced that she needed to stockpile blood before authorities interfered with her operations. The castle dungeons became a charnel house as Elizabeth and her assistants worked frantically to murder as many victims as possible. Elizabeth's final victims were treated with a cruelty that surpassed even her previous standards. She was no longer just killing for blood. She was killing out of rage at being questioned, fury at having her authority challenged, and desperation to maintain the lifestyle that had defined her identity for decades. By late 1610, the disappearance of so many noble girls could no longer be ignored or covered up. King Matthias II of Hungary, under pressure from powerful families who had lost daughters to Elizabeth's school, ordered Zorge Thurzo, the Palatine of Hungary and one of Elizabeth's own relatives, to investigate the allegations against the Blood Countess. Zorge was in an impossible position. Elizabeth was not only one of the most powerful people in Hungary, but also a member of his own extended family. Investigating her would require him to potentially destroy someone he had known since childhood, someone whose family had been allies of his family for generations. But the evidence against Elizabeth was becoming overwhelming, and even family loyalty had its limits. The investigation began secretly, with Thurzo's agents interviewing survivors who had escaped from Elizabeth's castle, family members of missing girls, and local officials who had been too intimidated to speak out previously. What they discovered was worse than anyone had imagined. A systematic campaign of torture and murder that had been going on for decades, with hundreds of victims. Witnesses described seeing rooms filled with dead bodies, dungeons equipped with elaborate torture devices, and evidence of cannibalism and blood-drinking rituals. They testified about hearing screams coming from the castle at all hours of the day and night, about seeing smoke from fires that burned human remains, and about the constant smell of death that surrounded Elizabeth's residence. The most damning evidence came from Elizabeth's own servants, who were captured and interrogated. Under torture, they confessed to helping with the murders and provided detailed accounts of Elizabeth's blood-bathing rituals, her cannibalistic practices, and her systematic torture of hundreds of young girls. Their testimonies matched the physical evidence found throughout the castle. Zephyros realized that he was dealing with crimes so extensive and horrific that they couldn't be covered up or minimized. The evidence pointed to Elizabeth being responsible for the deaths of at least 650 people, making her one of the most prolific serial killers in recorded history. But prosecuting someone of her status would create unprecedented legal and political challenges. On December 30th, 1610, Thurzo led a raid on Elizabeth's castle, hoping to catch her in the act and gather irrefutable evidence of her crimes. What they found exceeded their worst expectations. The castle was a house of horrors, with fresh bodies in the dungeons, torture victims still alive but barely clinging to life, and evidence of recent blood-bathing rituals throughout Elizabeth's private chambers. Elizabeth was found in her bedroom, calmly preparing for another bloodbath as if nothing unusual was happening. She showed no shame, no remorse, no recognition that she had done anything wrong. When confronted with the evidence of her crimes, she seemed genuinely confused about why anyone would object to her activities. In her mind, she had been conducting important scientific research into anti-aging treatments. The physical evidence was overwhelming. Investigators found detailed records that Elizabeth had kept of her victims, including their names, ages, physical descriptions, and notes about the quality of their blood. They discovered torture devices that had been custom-built according to Elizabeth's specifications, designed to maximize pain while keeping victims alive as long as possible. The dungeons revealed the true scope of Elizabeth's operations. Multiple cells contained living victims in various stages of torture, while others held fresh corpses that hadn't yet been disposed of. The smell of death and decay was so intense that several investigators became physically ill and had to leave the castle to recover. Elizabeth's assistants were arrested and put on trial immediately. Under interrogation, they provided detailed confessions about their roles in the murders and described Elizabeth's blood-bathing rituals in graphic detail. King Matthias wanted Elizabeth executed as an example to other nobles that no one was above the law. But Zephyro argued that executing such a prominent aristocrat would create political instability and potentially trigger conflicts with other noble families. They needed to find a solution that would stop Elizabeth's killing while avoiding the complications of a public trial. The compromise they reached was as revealing as it was horrific. Elizabeth would be sentenced to life imprisonment in her own castle, walled up in a set of rooms with no possibility of escape, but also no public trial or execution that might embarrass the noble class. She would be allowed to live, but never again have access to victims, or the ability to continue her blood-bathing rituals. Elizabeth's servants were not so fortunate. Dorothea Sentes, Iloneo, and Janos Ujvari were all tortured and executed in public as a warning to others who might be tempted to help powerful people commit crimes. Their executions were deliberately brutal, designed to satisfy the public's desire for justice while protecting Elizabeth from the same fate. On December 30th, 1610, Elizabeth Báthory was sealed into a set of rooms in her own castle, beginning a confinement that would last until her death. The rooms were bricked up with only small openings for passing food and removing waste. Elizabeth, who had spent decades surrounded by luxury and attended by dozens of servants, was suddenly alone with nothing but her thoughts and her memories of the hundreds of girls she had murdered. The psychological impact of the imprisonment on Elizabeth was immediate and severe. A woman who had wielded absolute power over other people's lives was suddenly powerless to control even the basic conditions of her own existence. She couldn't choose what to eat, when to sleep, or even when to see sunlight. The woman who had bathed in blood to stay young was now aging rapidly in solitary confinement. Elizabeth's first few months of imprisonment were marked by violent rage as she refused to accept her situation. She would scream for hours, demanding to be released, threatening her guards with torture and death, insisting that her powerful relatives would rescue her. She seemed genuinely unable to understand why she was being punished for what she considered legitimate scientific research into anti-aging treatments. As the months passed, Elizabeth's rage gave way to a different kind of madness. Cut off from her supply of young blood, she became obsessed with her own aging process, spending hours each day examining her reflection in a small mirror that had been left in her cell. She would document every new line, every gray hair, every sign that her beauty was finally fading, despite decades of murderous effort to preserve it. The guards who brought Elizabeth her food reported that she would beg them for blood, offering enormous sums of money, promising them positions of power in her household, even threatening to curse them and their families if they didn't help her continue her beauty treatments. She couldn't accept that her blood-bathing days were over and that she would age and die like any ordinary person. Elizabeth's physical health deteriorated rapidly in captivity. Without her bloodbaths and cannibalistic diet, her body began showing its true age for the first time in decades. The woman who had believed she had discovered the secret to eternal youth was forced to confront the reality that she was a middle-aged woman whose desperate efforts to stay young had all been based on delusion. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Elizabeth's imprisonment was that she never showed any remorse for her victims. In her diary, which was discovered after her death, she wrote extensively about missing her bloodbaths and regretting that she hadn't killed more girls while she had the opportunity. She never once expressed sorrow for the pain she had caused or acknowledged that her victims had been innocent people with lives worth preserving. Elizabeth's family worked frantically to distance themselves from her crimes and protect their reputation. Elizabeth Báthory died on August 21st, 1614. After less than 4 years in captivity, she was found dead in her cell, apparently having died in her sleep. The woman who had killed over 650 people in her quest to stay young had aged rapidly and died alone. Her beauty completely gone, her power completely destroyed, her legacy nothing but horror and shame. Her death marked the end of one of history's most extensive killing sprees. But it also marked the beginning of a centuries-long effort to minimize and romanticize her crimes. Elizabeth's story was transformed from historical fact into Gothic legend, with many details changed or omitted to make her seem more like a tragic figure than a calculating killer. The castle where Elizabeth had committed her crimes was abandoned and eventually fell into ruins. Local people avoided the area, believing it was cursed by the spirits of Elizabeth's victims. The physical evidence of her crimes gradually disappeared, but the psychological scars on Hungarian society lasted for generations. Today, Elizabeth Báthory is remembered primarily through horror movies and vampire legends, that bear little resemblance to the historical reality of her crimes. The real story of a wealthy woman who tortured and murdered hundreds of innocent people because she was afraid of getting old is far more terrifying than any fictional vampire tale, because it actually happened. The Blood Countess represents the ultimate cautionary tale about the corrupting effects of power, wealth, and vanity. She shows us what happens when someone believes they are above the law, when beauty becomes more important than human life, and when absolute power is combined with complete moral emptiness. Elizabeth Báthory wasn't a supernatural monster. She was something far worse. A human being who chose to become evil and had the power to act on that choice for decades without consequences. Her story reminds us that the real monsters aren't creatures of fantasy, but ordinary people who convince themselves that their desires are more important than other people's lives, that their problems justify any solution, and that power gives them the right to destroy anyone who stands in their way. Elizabeth Báthory bathed in blood to stay young, but in the end, she died old, alone, and remembered not for her beauty, but for her evil.